If there's one Swordmaster that pops to mind as potentially unthroning Rutger, it's Ryoma. It's often joked that his native route of Birthright is a 12-chapter campaign, because once you recruit the legendary wielder of Raijinto, the game is basically over. While plenty of characters in modern FE are capable of trivializing maps or even full campaigns if you give them the correct combination of resources, Ryoma does it for free. You don't need to do some complex chain of class dipping or tutor him in a specific school to unlock the correct combat art, or combine a ring ability with a well ability with all sorts of other nonsense. Ryoma just shows up in arguably his best class, Swordmaster, already has the Vantage skill alongside his personal weapon, and is one level away from acquiring Astra. And, well, the rest is history. Most enemies are going to miss this dodge tank, and the few that do hit him are just going to knock him into Vantage range, allowing him to crit and Astra future foes before they can even lay a hand on him. This is an impressive feat, but let's be honest. The foes in Birthright are weak enough that given enough attention and resources, any member of the cast can become an invincible juggernaut. So instead, what I personally find more interesting is that Ryoma manages to be almost as broken in the Revelation campaign, despite being faced with much more stat-crept foes. But before we begin, this video is part of an ongoing series where I'm doing a deep dive into every unit in the Revelation cast. If you're interested in looking at some of the previous units I've covered, they are in a playlist linked below, and if you'd like to vote on who gets covered next, consider supporting me on Patreon, where $5 and above backers have the ability to vote on not only reviews, but other stuff affecting the channel. With that being said, let's dive into today's unit review. Ryoma is one of the last Generation 1 units to join you. He shows up alongside Hinoka and her retainers in Chapter 15. And his stats are so ridiculous that for many players, he just immediately overshadows those three losers. A perfect demonstration of this is that the fastest way to clear Chapter 15 is to pair Scarlet and Corrin up and just have Ryoma charge to the left for 2 turns, at which point he has a 100% chance to one-round the boss Hans with no risk of death. Truly the most balanced unit of all time. As you would expect for a Swordmaster, Ryoma's speed is through the roof. With a base of 24 and a growth of 65, he's going to be doubling everything no problem. Even enemy Swordmasters are going to get hit twice by this ding-dong. What might surprise you about his stat spread, however, is Ryoma has really high strength as well. He technically has a base of 20, but functionally that's a 24, because his personal weapon, the Raijinto, gives him +4 strength just for being in his inventory. It doesn't even need to be equipped or equipable for him to get this bonus. Just being in one of the 5 inventory slots is enough. But wait, there's more, because if you thought a functional strength stat of 24 was good, Ryoma functionally has a strength stat of 26 actually, thanks to his personal skill Bushido. If he is supported by a lower or equal level unit, Ryoma gains 2 damage dealt and takes 2 less damage. So functionally, he gets a 2 strength boost and a 2 defense and resistance boost. The condition of Ryoma being supported by a unit who is equal or lower level is super easy to accomplish. Firstly, because Ryoma is going to be one of your higher level units just by virtue of joining as a pre-promote, and because any unit who is in the dedicated pair-up bot role is usually going to see a severe cut to their experience gain. So if you give Ryoma a pair-up backpack, then that unit is virtually guaranteed to be a lower level than him. But even ignoring these 2 factors, Ryoma's role in most armies is as an enemy phase sweeper, After all, he's one of the few units in Rev who is well suited to this role. As such, he's likely to get a significantly larger cut of the experience pie than people who are only attacking on player phase. Now, you might be wondering why I say Ryoma is especially suited for enemy phase when Swordmasters are traditionally frail, but Ryoma apparently didn't get that memo. His defense and resistance are also quite high, with 16 defense and 13 res, but that's before factoring in the Bushido bonus. He functionally will have 18 defense and 15 res. Although at many points Ryoma is going to have a katana equipped, and that brings the functional defense down to 17 and the functional res down to 14. Regardless, this combined with his 36 and 8 HP is enough that in most situations, Ryoma can reliably live 2, 3, and sometimes even 4 attacks from enemies. And the fact that he has nearly equal defense and res means that Ryoma doesn't need to worry about the various hybrid units who tend to prey on tanks by attacking whichever defensive stat is weaker. Now, you're probably still not convinced of Ryoma's enemy phase potential, because, let's be honest, getting 3 or 4 rounded is what I would consider to be a relatively frail unit in most other Fire Emblem settings. But Rev isn't like most Fire Emblems. It's built different. Enemies hit so hard that a lot of your team will just get 1 rounded by them, and those that aren't are almost certainly getting killed in 2 hits. Getting 3 or 4 rounded is absolutely an impressive bulk threshold. And that's in large part because you can use the various Fates mechanics to further accentuate this bulk advantage, specifically through pair up and guard gauge. Whenever a paired up unit participates in combat in Fire Emblem Fates, they will gain 2 points of guard gauge for every attack attempted by either combatant. And these attacks do not have to land. Misses will still give you points of guard gauge. Technically speaking, the way these points are assigned is 1 to each pair-up partner, and this becomes relevant if you unpair while you have a partially filled guard gauge, but for the purposes of this calculation, it's easiest to think of the guard gauge being shared amongst the paired-up units, especially since you're not able to unpair on enemy phase. If an enemy ever attacks you while you have a full guard gauge at 10 points, your pair partner will automatically block that attack and prevent any damage that would have been dealt to you. Then your guard gauge resets to 0 and begins building up again. Functionally, what this means is if you are capable of doubling every single enemy you fight, you will block every other attack attempted against you. That's because in every round of combat, you'll gain 6 points of guard gauge, 2 from the enemy's attack and 4 from your counterattacks. Now, as we already went over, Ryoma's speed stat is absurd. He's going to be doubling every single enemy, even without speed support most of the time. As such, when preparing Ryoma for an enemy phase, typically it's safe to assume he's only going to be taking half of the attacks that go his way. So if Ryoma is bulky enough that he can survive 3 hits and gets killed by the 4th attack, then functionally that converts to being able to survive against 6 enemies, since 3 of those enemies will have their attacks automatically blocked by guard gauge. Except for, okay, so that's not entirely true, because this calculation relies on the false assumption that you are going to be hitting every single enemy twice, and in Ryoma's case, that's simply not happening. This isn't because he's going to fail to double some super fast enemies, or because there's any wary fighter foes in the Revelation route, but instead it's because there's always the chance that Ryoma lands a critical hit on his first attack and just kills his opponent without having the chance to double and hit him again. If Ryoma gets attacked and then counters with a critical hit which kills, that's only 4 points of guard gauge, not 6, and as a result, he'll take 1 more attack than you planned for. And that can be the difference between life and death with enemies as strong as the ones in Revelation. Worse still, remember that super powerful personal skill Bushido, which is trivially easy to keep active and gives Ryoma a significant buff to both the damage he deals and his defenses? Yeah, it has a third effect. It also gives him 10 extra crit. So, in addition to the innate crit Ryoma gets from his stats, he's boosting a crit bonus with his personal skill. But wait, it gets worse, because Swordmaster, the class that Ryoma starts in and the one that he wants to stay in for most of the campaign, has a 10 crit bonus, which means actually he has 20 crit before factoring in his stats. But wait, it gets even worse, because Ryoma's personal weapon, Raijinto, that super powerful blade that gives him +4 strength, has 5 crit on it. So if you have Raijinto equipped, which, let's face it, if you're enemy facing, you probably do, Ryoma has an innate critical hit rate of 25% before factoring in the crit he gains from his stats. Now, most enemy phase units will resolve this problem by using either a bronze or brass weapon. These weapons have the innate inability to crit, so you can guarantee just how many charges of guard gauge you will gain in each round of combat, since there's no damage variation. And if faced with only one-range enemies, Ryoma certainly can grab a bronze sword in order to deal with these foes without the variance that comes from his critical hit rate. But it's also pretty hard to deny that at least some amount of the appeal of making Ryoma an enemy phase god is his access to the super strong 1-2 range PRF sword. Vala is full of foes with access to 1-2 range. So if you want to be an enemy phase sweeper, then you probably want to have some 1-2 range of your own. And with that in mind, I think this is probably as good a time as any to take a close look at Raijinto. Raijinto is an 11 might weapon with 80 hit, 5 crit, and an inbuilt avoid of 10. Additionally, as previously mentioned, it gives Ryoma a 4 strength bonus for being in his inventory. And because Raijinto is considered a katana, if you ever equip it, you get a 1 speed bonus in exchange for losing 1 defense and res. 11 might makes this lightning sword a pretty hefty weapon. It's only 1 less power than the steel axe and has much better accuracy alongside not cutting your speed. But the main selling point of Ryoma's legendary blade is its inherent 1-2 range. Because most 1-2 range weapons in Fates offer significant restrictions. You can't double, you can't crit, you can't proc skills, and you get slowed down. Now, you can access unrestricted 1-2 range with tomes and daggers, but these weapons have lower might than the traditional swords, lances, axes, and bows. So the fact that Raijinto offers 1-2 range with no downsides and has nearly triple the might of an iron dagger is incredibly noteworthy. But when people talk about Raijinto, I feel like they focus entirely on the upsides, while failing to acknowledge that the weapon itself does have a couple of innate flaws. I already touched on how unrestricted 1-2 range isn't all it's cracked up to be, because while having the ability to double is almost always positive, crits and proc skills are a much more mixed bag. And while it is always possible to unequip stuff like Luna and Astra, the same doesn't apply to Ryoma's critical hit chance. Raijinto also has a somewhat unimpressive hit stat at 80. For context, that's 5 less hit than an unforged steel sword, and an equivalent amount of hit to an unforged steel axe. Even with Ryoma's relatively impressive skill base of 18, he only has 117 hit with the Raijinto. 117 sounds pretty good until you factor in enemy avoid, as well as frequent weapon triangle disadvantage, because lances and shurikens are very common in the Fates trilogy. This means Ryoma can often find himself in situations where his accuracy is not terrible, but somewhat questionable, especially if facing dodgy foes like Swordmasters and Master Ninjas. And unlike other common victims of skill issues, Ryoma doesn't have any accuracy fixing skills in his base kit, and instead needs to acquire them via supports. This wouldn't be the end of the world for a character who joined earlier in the campaign, but Ryoma's pretty late to the party. So having to train up for 5 or even 7 maps just to reach the support level for a reclass is less than ideal. I don't want to give the wrong idea. Raijinto is still a very powerful weapon, and Ryoma should have it in his kit and use it whenever it is useful. But I don't think Raijinto should be the only weapon you ever use. Ryoma will benefit from supplementing it with things like a forged bronze sword, an armor slayer, the dual katana, and perhaps even a non-sword weapon if you are reclassing Ryoma, either temporarily or permanently. Although, on the topic of choosing to reclass or not reclass Ryoma, I want to talk about a few potential build options. The first and most low investment is simply to leave Ryoma as a Swordmaster and treat him like the enemy phase sweeper I described when explaining the mechanics of guard gauge. Now you might be wondering why I would suggest this as even being a viable build. After all, I just talked about how Raijinto gets in the way of Ryoma's ability to utilize guard gauge for enemy phasing. And while that is true, Ryoma himself does have other tools that can make up for this downside. Specifically, I'm talking about the Swordmaster skills of Vantage and Astra, alongside Ryoma's respectable Avoid stat. These traits combine to tip the RNG in your favor and, in my opinion, outweigh the negative RNG that comes with Raijinto randomly critting. Let's start by talking about Ryoma's Avoid stat. Ryoma's 24 base speed grants him 36 Avoid on its own, and his 20 luck gives him 10 more on top of that, for a total of 46 Avoid purely from Ryoma's base stats. However, the Swordmaster class gives Ryoma another 10 Avoid for 56, and equipping Raijinto gives Ryoma another 10 for 66 Avoid, and 1 extra point of speed, which translates to another point of Avoid, for a total of 67 Avoid just at base. This is frequently enough to reduce enemies to the 30, 40, or 50% hit ranges. Not so low that Ryoma is guaranteed to dodge, but low enough that you can reasonably depend on some number of lucky misses. And because an attack missing still contributes to your guard gauge, Ryoma can take advantage of his Avoid while also relying on guard meter to limit the number of attacks he faces overall. On its own, the Avoid is nice, but I don't think it would be enough to tip the scales in your favor. But thankfully, Ryoma starts with the Vantage skill, which means if he's ever at 50% HP or lower, he will always attack first, even on enemy phase. This not only occasionally gives you a chance to supplement your guard gauge by attacking before your foe gets a chance, thus making up for some of the charges lost to careless critical hits, but it also turns the tables and makes Raijinto's critical hit rate an actual good thing. Because if you are attacking with Vantage and you happen to score a critical hit, you kill the enemy and then they can't deal any damage to you. And as we just went over, Ryoma's critical hit rate is not trivial. It's going to vary depending on enemy crit avoid, but it's not unusual to have at least a 1 out of 3 chance to just absolutely nuke your foe from orbit. But critical hits aren't the only way you can RNG yourself into a murder. Astra is the level 5 Swordmaster skill, and Ryoma is only 1 level up from learning it. and it gives him a skill divided by 2% chance to land 5 attacks at half power instead of just 1 attack. 2.5 times is slightly less power than the 3 times damage multiplier from a critical hit, but it's still going to be more than enough to one-shot basically any foe Ryoma faces. But Astra also has a second upside as compared to critical hits, because every strike from an Astra proc counts for 2 points of guard gauge. In theory, this means that the 5 hits from Astra are going to completely fill up all 10 guard gauge procs, and therefore give you an automatic guard for the next attack. But in practice, this is rarely the case. Ryoma's high critical hit rate is once more a downside, because he is almost certainly going to crit on the second or third attack, but still, 4 or 6 ticks is better than 2. All of these aspects come together to weigh the odds of any enemy phase Ryoma participates in pretty heavily in his favor. You can't be reckless and just throw him in range of 50 enemies, but you can afford to extend him farther than the many other frail members of your squad. That being said, there are still a couple of downsides I would associate with this build of the Lobster Man. The most prominent and obvious one is he's grounded in a game where flight is incredibly important, although this can be somewhat solved through a proper pair-up partner. Both Camilla and Xander enjoy being in Wyvern, and either of them makes a decent spouse for Ryoma. So you can theoretically have them fly Ryoma across a gap and then switch him to the front position for enemy phase, but this only gives Ryoma a single turn of flight, so it doesn't exactly solve the problem of him being grounded. And as such, you may genuinely want to consider just abandoning the movement issues altogether and having Ryoma settle down with a nice country girl from the Fire Tribe, specifically Rinka. Not only does Rinka offer a significant bulk boost with her S-Support pair-up bonuses, but she also gives Ryoma access to the Blacksmith class, and with it, Lancebreaker. As I keep mentioning, blue weapons are the bane of Ryoma's existence, and while he doesn't have any way of accessing Shuriken Breaker outside of Korin Marriage, Lancebreaker is within his grasp, and it can really turn the table on those pesky Naginata users. By getting a massive 50 hit and avoid boost, Ryoma brings Lance users down to the same level of all of the other enemies that only have a 20 to 30% chance to land an attack. But unfortunately, that segues us pretty nicely into the other major issue with this build, and that is the fact that this is still, at the end of the day, a very RNG dependent setup. I think the haters can sometimes over-exaggerate just how much Swordmaster Ryoma relies on RNG. This is much closer to Balatro or Clover Pit than it is a truly random game of poker or slots. But no matter how much you tip the odds in your favor, there's always going to be a chance of failure associated with a character relying on dodges, crits, and Astra. So, if you're super reliability pilled, you might be tempted to reclass Ryoma to Master Ninja in order to pursue a version of this build that is slightly less powerful, but significantly more reliable. By casting aside his legendary blade and embracing the power of forged brass shurikens, Ryoma is finally able to reach a position where you can accurately calculate just how many ticks of guard gauge you will gain in every round of combat. The price you pay for this, however, is a fairly significant fall off in damage potential. Ryoma loses a point of strength right off the bat, and his growth rate goes down as well. But the more extreme difference is the Brass Shuriken's pathetic 2 might in comparison to Raijinto's 11. That is a 9 might fall off, and 10 damage if we're factoring in the strength. Now, Brass Shurikens are forgeable, and after chapter 19 you get a pretty big gold influx, so it's not that difficult to forge Ryoma the Fraudjinto, or whatever funny name you want to give his Disc of Death. But if you're sticking to reasonably priced forges, there's still going to be a significant damage falloff. A Brass Shuriken plus 1 is 4 might, and a Brass Shuriken plus 2 is 6. Even the exorbitantly expensive Brass Shuriken plus 3 has only 8 might attached to it, and personally, I don't even think this is really worth the gold you spend on it unless you're doing some sort of Ryoma solo run. But things might not be as dire as they seem in the damage department. Because one major difference between daggers and swords is what part of the weapon triangle they occupy. Daggers are a blue weapon, whereas swords are a red one. The most common weapon types in Fate's Revelation have blue weapons, and I believe this was intentional to keep Xander and Ryoma in check. You see, whenever a character is at weapon triangle disadvantage, they can no longer use their weapon rank bonuses. And starting from C rank, these bonuses will add on to the damage you're dealing. In transitioning from the red team to the blue team, Ryoma positions himself in a situation where he'll get to take advantage of these weapon rank bonuses more frequently. Although it is worth noting that he has an innate sword rank of B, whereas his hidden weapons start out at E rank. So he will need to build up Dagger and Shuriken rank before he can fully take advantage of weapon rank bonuses. Whereas swords would get the weapon rank bonus anytime they're not facing a Dagger or Lance user. As a result, this change in weapon type can be a bit of a mixed bag for Ninja Ryoma, but I do think it is worth acknowledging, and in the long term, it does come out as an upside, in my opinion. Another upside to Ninja Ryoma you might not expect is he actually becomes ever so slightly bulkier. As a Master Ninja, Ryoma gains 3 points of resistance as compared to his Sword Master bases. And while he technically loses 1 point of defense, functionally it evens out because he's no longer going to be equipping a katana, and therefore will not have the -1 defense res penalty. So he functionally has the same physical defense and 4 more resistance. Now, as for how you get into Ninja, Ryoma can acquire the class from either of his retainers, Saizo and Kagero. Although personally, I would recommend getting it through Saizo since it is a fast friendship and therefore only takes 4 maps in comparison to Kagero's 6. It is also worth noting that since you can't activate support conversations in between chapters 16 and 17, Ryoma can only reach C rank after chapter 17. And as a result, the earliest that you can acquire Ninja without using any paralogs is at the end of chapter 20. Not too late, but not as early as you would like. The main problem Ryoma has with acquiring Ninja is the fact that he desperately wants to be in guard stance to benefit from guard gauge, but also really doesn't care for the bonuses offered by a Master Ninja or Mechanist. But if you'll allow me to go on a slight tangent, there's kind of a cool team building pathing you can do in order to solve this problem. Because the A+ supports are one way, Ryoma can acquire Ninja from Saizo even if Saizo has already pursued a different friendship. So in the early chapters of the campaign, you can pursue a friendship between Saizo and Tsubaki. This is already a fairly beneficial pairing because Tsubaki appreciates ninja access, but Saizo gaining Falco Knight can also benefit us if we are using him to escort Ryoma around Vala. Because while Ryoma doesn't particularly care about the stats a Falco Knight backpack offers, he does pretty desperately want to get ferried around the maps full of emptiness, forests, and other flyable hazards. So a Falco Knight Saizo can come to the rescue, and hey, Darting Blow actually kind of benefits the Red Christmas Ninja, since speed is one of his weaker areas. It's a win-win-win scenario, and just one of many examples why the Fates support reclassing system is so neat. Getting back on topic to Ryoma, there are 2 other potential Dagger classes you might consider for him, although I think both of them are pretty significantly worse than Master Ninja. Mechanist offers a boost in strength and physical bulk in exchange for lower speed and resistance. At first, this seems pretty good since Ryoma is already quite fast, but I actually think the 3 functional speed he loses, going from 25 to 22, is a pretty big deal. It knocks him down from an absurdly fast character to just a decently fast one. And as a result, some of the speediest foes in the game can be more difficult for you to double, especially since the speed growth rate is also reduced in Mechanist. So as the campaign continues forward, a Mechanist Ryoma will fall further and further behind the Swordmaster and Master Ninja equivalents. It's also worth noting that Master Ninja gets the Shuriken Fair skill, a +5 boost to all damage with shurikens. Now, you can, of course, dip into Master Ninja, grab Shuriken Fair, and then move back into Mechanist if you want to take advantage of both the high strength class and the +5 damage boost, but at that point, we kind of risk turning Ryoma into a high investment character, and to be honest, this build doesn't feel so significantly different from the standard Raijinto Swordmaster one that I would consider it to be worth a ton of different forges and seals all put together. The third potential dagger class is Butler, and this one feels pretty bad. It is almost strictly worse than both Mechanist and Master Ninja, simultaneously offering undesirable stat spreads and skills. Worse still, the only way for Ryoma to acquire it without Corrin's help is by marrying Elise, and not only does this come with kind of gross ethical implications, but it also takes a full 7 maps and requires you to deploy a pretty subpar troubadour for that entire time. It's just really not worth your time. It may be boring, but Master Ninja is the GOAT for a reason. And as an extra benefit, Ryoma can still take advantage of his sword rank in Master Ninja if the opportunity arises. Whipping out an Armor Slayer or even the Raijinto in case of emergency can have its uses, despite the fact that the main purpose of Master Ninja is to throw forged shurikens at your foes. Now, I understand for some people, having Ryoma reclass into a role where he can't use his personal weapon feels somewhat unintuitive and can be an off-putting prospect. So if you don't want to give up on the sword, I've got you covered. Because there's another enemy phase build you can do with Ryoma that not only uses Raijinto, but is fundamentally tied to the Samurai class line. And that is the Vantage Sweeper. A Vantage Sweeper is a character who gets such high attack stacking, both through raw stats and through skills, that they are able to one-shot any foe who attacks them. Then they intentionally drop to low HP so that they can activate Vantage to one-shot everyone before anyone has a chance to attack them. In Rev, it's exceptionally difficult to reach one-shotting benchmarks since enemy stats are so high, but Ryoma benefits from the fact that Raijinto has a higher might than javelins, hand axes, throwing clubs, and kodachi, so he already has a jump start and has easy access to both Vantage and Life and Death. Still, despite his impressively high base stats, I don't think Vantage Sweeper Ryoma gets enough raw power to safely commit to the build on higher difficulties, which is why I'm going to instead recommend a DVAS build. This stands for Dual Vantage Attack Stance, and it's a combo I've discussed on a couple of previous reviews. The general idea is you train up 2 Vantage Sweepers and have them move around in attack stance with each other. Then, whenever either of them gets attacked, you can land 2 powerful blows, 1 main attack and 1 dual strike. In Fates, dual strikers only deal half of their attack power, but oftentimes a 1.5 multiplier is enough to ensure the one-shot against most enemies. You just gotta pick the right pair-up partner. And in Ryoma's case, 3 in particular stand out: Camilla, Silas, and Xander. When in attack stance, Camilla bolsters Ryoma's damage thanks to Rose's Thorns, and Silas is just a generally strong pre-promote whose only Achilles heel is the speed stat, which doesn't matter in a DVAS build. But the Ryoma Xander pairing is where things get interesting. Both of these characters have access to strong 1-2 range swords, and in theory, these would be the weapons you leverage when doing a DVAS build. But accuracy is exceptionally important for Vantage Sweepers. After all, an untimely miss often spells getting added to the death counter. As I went over before, the 80 hit on Raijinto is a little unfortunate for Ryoma, although it's honestly not the end of the world against most enemies. And a similar principle applies to the Siegfried, which also has 80 hit, but is somewhat made up for by Xander's high skill stat. However, when you combine these two somewhat inaccurate weapons together, and need to rely on both of them hitting every round of combat in order to maximize your Vantage sweeping potential, things get kind of sketchy. Then, once you factor in the large number of super dodgy enemies, including Master Ninjas who have weapon triangle advantage over you, DVAS with the Blowjob Brothers seems a lot less appealing. That being said, I wouldn't say this build is completely worthless. There is a kind of interesting workaround you can do to this predicament, and that is sending both Ryoma and Xander into the Great Knight class, where they can take advantage of their special swords alongside forged javelins and hand axes for perfect triangle advantage regardless of which foe you're up against. As they deal the most damage, your swords are probably going to be the default option, but using forged throwables to increase accuracy selectively is also a valid tactic to put in place on specific enemy phases. But okay, real talk, this build is super silly, and it likely requires a arm scroll for one or both of the princes, so we're once again veering into the territory of turning Ryoma, who should be one of the most low investment units in the cast, into a bizarrely high invest character. How do I keep doing that? I mean, part of it is just my obsession with really bizarre builds, which are themselves inherently high investment, but even factoring that in, things are getting kind of out of hand. Let's dial it back by talking about one last build, one that's a little bit more grounded than all of these out there class-dipping combos. Although, ironically, it's not actually a grounded build because it's using Ryoma's Heart Seal to turn him into a flyer. Kinshi Knight is one of the strongest classes in Fire Emblem Fates Revelation. It combines bow access with flight, two incredibly valuable assets to anyone trying to kill foes on player phase. The main downside associated with the class is it doesn't have particularly good stat modifiers, but Ryoma has such high stats at base that this isn't really a problem for him. As such, if you want to expand your Air Force and are fine with ditching Raijinto, Ryoma can just eat a partner seal right out the gate and feel like a second version of Reina, who trades a little bit of offensive prowess for better bulk. Now, while making Ryoma into a Kinshi Knight does turn him into a generically good unit, there are a couple of reasons why you might hesitate to pull the trigger on this. The first is that Ryoma ends up with E rank in both bows and lances. This means he will feel a little bit worse than your other lance and bow users, who have options like dual weapons, effective weapons, or the guard naginata they can whip out in situations where they might be helpful. Ryoma also gets Kinshi Knight from the Sky Knight line rather than the Archer line, so instead of Quick Draw, he'll end up with Darting Blow, and since Ryoma's speed in Kinshi Knight is already quite good, this can feel like overkill and kind of a waste of a skill slot. Of course, you can fix this by getting Ryoma's friendship with his brother Takumi, which unlocks the Archer line and therefore would allow him to go into the Sniper class line once you get to the end of the Rev campaign and want to start dismounting your flyers. And Sniper would also open up the option to add certain blow or bow fare to Ryoma's final bow-based build. I honestly don't have too much else to say about this build. Ryoma has good stats, and Kinshi Knight is a good class. Combining good stats with a good class is a recipe for success. It's not particularly interesting or intuitive, but it'll get the job done. Honestly, the coolest thing about this build is probably that you can refer to it as Ryboma. And that alone should be enough to justify running it at least once. Before moving on to the tier list, I do want to talk about one underexplored aspect of Ryoma's kit, that being his kind of ridiculous pair-up bonuses. His personal pair-up bonuses give 3 speed, a point of strength, and a point of skill. This means in his native class of Swordmaster, at S support, he gives 8 points of speed alongside that point of strength. And this is a ridiculous speed boost. It's enough to take someone who is getting doubled and push them over the edge to the point where now they are the one doubling. Now, unfortunately, 2 points of that speed come from the S support alone, so an A support partner only gets 6, but still 6 is a very significant boost. Especially if you consider the point of strength to be a little bit of sugar on top. Don't get me wrong, Ryoma is way too strong a unit to be put in the dedicated backpack role. However, I think that his pair-up bonuses are relevant if he marries a unit who wants to participate in guard stance with him. In this situation, rather than committing either the husband or wife to the pure backpack role, you can have them switch between frontal positions in order to take on challenges that each one is uniquely suited for. I think the ideal wife for this scenario is Camilla. She's a flyer and she has axes, whereas Ryoma is grounded and has swords. So if you need to deal with a large horde of enemies that you plan on dodging or vantaging, Ryoma takes the front position. But if he gets too injured or you need to fly somewhere and fight lance enemies, Camilla switches to the front. Camilla's speed is already pretty good, but a +8 modifier pushes it from good to great, at which point she could easily find herself taking on Master Ninjas with no problem. Similarly, I like pairing Xander and Ryoma with each other. In part, this is because Ryoma gives Swordmaster to Xander, and Swordmaster Xander is just a really strong build. But while you're building their friendship up, Wyvern Xander really appreciates the 6 speed boost that Swordmaster Ryoma gives him. It's not enough to make him a speed demon, but it saves him from getting doubled by a lot of foes who would otherwise deal way more damage than they have any right to. As for his position in the tier list, I think Ryoma comfortably slots into A tier. I'm confident keeping him high because while Ryoma is a late joiner, I think the back half of Rev is much harder than the front portion. That being said, I don't think the Lobster Lord is powerful enough to creep into S, simply because at the time that he joins, you've got plenty of other powerful units as well. Camilla and Reina are unique in that they are likely ahead of everyone else you have available with the exception of Corrin. But Ryoma joins around the same time as Shura, Leo, Xander, and Fugo, thus making him a lot less essential, even if he is still incredibly powerful. I know this placement is probably a little bit controversial for such an iconic character, but it's important to remember Ryoma isn't the auto win condition in Rev that he manages to be in Birthright. Still, I'm curious to hear what other people think in the comments. Would you have put Ryoma in S tier, or do you think I was too kind to him considering how late he joins in comparison to the rest of the cast? What's your favorite thing to do with Ryoma? Do you keep him in a Raijinto class, or just take advantage of the stats in something better than Swordmaster? And while you're down there commenting, considering giving the channel a like, subscription, or even supporting me on Patreon if you're financially capable. Speaking of which, I want to thank my patrons now. Thank you to Glup Shido, Electric Giga, Erica Ford, YLO1, George Grenville, The 7th PM, Jamie Collins, Arvis, Crispy Matthews, Floahay, Amy Hazel, Hungry Heart, Shinthia, Faulty Videos, Kyle Madison, Derek Williams, Anna Cabana, The Daily Foogle, Faye, Magic Bite, Thoughtful Insanity, Robin Goodfeller, JT Spreader, Ziggy WSB, Dysike, Chris, Root Beer Pants, Queen Eliza, Control Aegis, Roman Kromancic, Nick Knack, Hammer Smack, Carrier Has Left, Angel Nut Caceres, Zanwiff, Edward C, Cyrockin 2, Cabbage, SUP, Caius Cole, Bree, Punchfighter Champion, Eggman, Maxine the Vampire Queen, Drakenback Lancer, Sardonic Muse, Zero Gamer, Femtal Illness, Wannabe Cinnabon, Punk Tattoo Guy, Key the Iron Idol, Calamity Callie, Jax McMahon, Saren Gurlixy, Rezi, Andu, Rhea, Gameboo, Carosa, Fyrant, Your Doctor, Frozen Helm, Pat Witt, Pillow, Willow, Girl Boss, Lizard Ballwater, Christopher Bueno, Marin McLean, Jaden, Dylan Solis, Forever Lucas, Some Trades, Guizzi555, Smas Ruby, Cycrom, Robin D, Alendi, Hound Dogs, They Thumb, Klon, and especially my Jagans, Your Best Friend 9000, Adele, Alexander Roper, Sensitive Luigi, Siggy, and Lil Man. If you're interested in joining the names on this list or getting the ability to vote on things for the channel, including who the next review will be on, there is a link to my Patreon below. But please only donate if you can comfortably afford to do so. I don't want anyone going broke for Fire Emblem. Liking, commenting, subscribing, all that fun stuff is free, but for now, I'm just gonna say stay safe, gamers, and have a wonderful day.